Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. This is the next in my series of rereading the iconic and classic Hardy Boys canon of books, but also comparing the original text with the revised text. Now, briefly for those who haven't seen one of my previous videos or know anything about the revisions, and starting in 1959, the Stratemeyer Syndicate, who basically created a lot of series books and, of course, were the owners of the Hardy Boys, decided to modernize and update the books that had been written to that point and started a multi-year and actually technically multi-decade process of having different authors come in at different times and revise, drastically alter, or sometimes completely change the original books to bring them more up to date. The idea and sort of notion that was passed around was to remove dated stereotyping and other elements that were obviously not politically correct or elements that very much dated them to the original time in which they were written, which goes all the way back to The Tower Treasure, which was book one, which was written and published in 1927. So obviously there had been a gap between 1927 and 1959, so it made sense why they would want to remove some outdated stereotyping, but also there wasn't terribly much of that to begin with in most of the books, and it seems that the ulterior motive was also to streamline the books a bit and also shorten the page count, which meant they could publish slimmer volumes, which of course was cheaper. So it was also a means of cost cutting and saving money. So it was really for two different reasons. Now, in terms of most of the books, the stereotyping and other very dated elements and the inherent racism of the time in which they were written, it's usually quite minor because it only pops up sporadically with a few side characters who might appear here and there rather fleetingly. However, there are a couple of books, especially at this point in the series, books 11 through 14 for some reason seem to have the most of this, but it's certain books that have the most material that is very obviously not politically correct and very much outdated and of its time, and it does contain inherent racism in terms of the racial stereotyping. And book 14, The Hidden Harbor Mystery, is typically the one that is felt to have the most of it, where it is quite obvious. Now, this is in reference to the original 1935 text written by series creator Leslie McFarlane, who wrote most of the first 26 books. And then, of course, it was also one of the first books to actually be revised. So it was revised quite early in the process in 1961. And the revised text was written by James Buechler, who wrote several volumes in the actual canon series that kept going. So after the revision process started, he had written a couple, and he wrote 2 or 3 of the revised texts, such as the revised text for The Missing Chums and While the Clock Ticks. So he was no stranger to the Hardy Boys, but I think it's interesting to note that certain authors like Buechler only wrote a handful of books, and anytime you've got an author change, that gives you a slightly different voice in terms of the writing and the tone. I think he does some really interesting plot adjustments while keeping some of the core ideas, which actually make the revised text quite interesting and stand on its own, just like he did on The Missing Chums, for example, by restructuring certain elements and focusing more on other parts of the original plot and less so on how the original text was structured. Now, to address the elephant in the room, this is obviously, when looking at the original text, a work that was written in 1935. It is of its time, and it does reflect some of the same stereotyping that you see to varying degrees in the original text. Again, most of the original textbooks, this is very minor. Some don't have any at all. And it's nothing outside of the realm of fiction of the time that you would encounter, especially if you read a lot of pulp magazine stories of the time, a lot of adventure stories, and of course, films and other media of the time. Unfortunately, this was inherently part of our pop culture, and people didn't see that this was extraordinarily insensitive and racist and obviously stereotyping. So it it is what it is. It could be a lot worse, but this is one of the books, and usually it's this one in particular, the original text of the Hidden Harbor Mystery, that of all of the original text canon Hardy Boys books, it's always the Hidden Harbor Mystery that people remember and can point to as the one that has the most notable examples of the racial stereotyping. And that's really because the main villain of the piece, even though it's not structured in terms of the plot to actually have a overall villain behind the entirety of the scheme, but our essentially main villain is revealed to be a black character. And when he does appear in the story, he is given the typical of the time dialogue in terms of the text. It's, filled with broken speech patterns and things, and is obviously a racial stereotype. It's nowhere near the worst that you can encounter in a work of this time period, but it is obviously racial stereotyping, and is something that would have been eliminated in the revision process first and foremost, which is why the Hidden Harbor Mystery was one of the first books to get revised. And that's why it's one of the most difficult books to get a good condition copy of an original text edition, which is why this video has been somewhat delayed, because this is the one book that's eluded me in terms of getting a solid, cleaner original text edition, because there's less of them out there, and it's harder to get a good condition one, so you usually have to pay more, and I've gone through several copies trying to get a better one, so it did take a little bit of doing to get a cleaner condition original text copy, and that's because this is one of the first books to be revised, and understandably so. However, I must admit that the actual black characters, because there's really only two that have major speaking roles, and the second is much more of a side character. There's not as much of actual, in terms of the actual page count or the of their actual appearances overall than what you got in the original text of Book 12 with the Chinese characters in Footprints Under the Window. So interestingly, even though Hidden Harbor Mystery is the book that always gets singled out as the one that has the most offensive racial stereotyping and is the worst offender in that regard, when you actually read the original text, if that is something that you want to focus on in terms of studying why the revisions were done, there's actually not a whole lot in Hidden Harbor Mystery in terms of the amount of it and how much of these two characters in particular are in the story. And that's also due to how the actual plotting and structure of the original text is. And it's actually quite different, and a different approach to what the revised text does. This is an example of where the revised text is obviously trying to eliminate or completely eradicate the most problematic element of the original text, which is the racial stereotyping for the sort of primary villain who's a sort of third party in the mystery. But the actual approach and how the Hardy Boys themselves get involved in the plot and the actual structure is entirely different in terms of how the two texts approach what is essentially the same core story. So a little bit of plot setup, because both stories wind up in the same locale, but they have completely different approaches. In the original text, Frank and Joe Hardy get involved in in the case they find themselves in. It's not really a case, because we actually start the book with a literal bang, because the boys, along with their longtime chum Chet Morton, are aboard the steamship or cruise liner the Resolute, and they're bringing back some handwriting samples for their father Fenton Hardy for a case he's working on. They befriend Old Man Blackstone, who's on board the ship, and encourage him to store his money in the ship's safe, because they don't want this kindly old man losing his money or getting robbed or something. And then because the sea is very rough and there's a storm going, the ship strikes a rock and actually starts sinking. So we have a whole sinking ship scenario, and the boys have to escape and help Old Man Blackstone, who's actually been attacked just before this point, and they all barely manage to escape. They get split up. They don't know if Frank has even survived because the ship also explodes, which is depicted on the cover of the second artwork design. And then that takes up a good chunk of the opening because that's a really well done, drawn out sequence that literally, again, starts the book with a bang. And then the boys have to essentially get home, and everybody has to realize they're still alive and they have to recover. But they're shocked to learn that Old Man Blackstone, who was saved by Frank Hardy by essentially swimming him to shore and keeping him alive, has had a severe concussion and is in the hospital, but has also been robbed, and identifies the Hardy Boys themselves as the ones who robbed him. And so then it becomes a matter of the boys themselves having to try to prove their innocence, and they are actually arrested and are out on bail, and then decide to go to Blackstone's hometown to try and figure out who the real culprit might be. So it's another of the original texts that directly place the Hardy Boys themselves under the microscope, and they're kind of under the gun because they have to prove their innocence, and they've actually been arrested, as they were in the Great Airport Mystery in the original text. So it very much gives the story drive and focus, but the mystery to be solved is obviously to try and figure out who the real culprit is and prove their innocence. But once they arrive in the small town, they discover that there's been this long-standing family feud between the Blackstones and the Rand family. And they know that one of the Rands, Ruel Rand, was on board the ship and has it out for Blackstone and to continue this long-standing family feud. And it is very much in a southern town, and we have lovely descriptions of there being this big estate with all of these beautifully overgrown trees, and we have the two mansions of each of the family, and that this is a multi-generational feud that's been going on. So there's almost a tinge of a sort of Southern Gothic flavor, and it's a great setting, but it takes a while to get to this point. Most of the book, at least the first half, is going through the sinking of the ship and the boys getting falsely accused and having to get out on bail and then deciding to go and investigate. And if that weren't enough, they are still under suspicion, and others even have private detectives following them that the boys have to elude. So essentially they arrive in the southern town and go camping out where they can't be spotted so they can observe the goings-on at both of the mansions and try to figure out who is behind the attack on Blackstone and prove their innocence. And the sort of B plot is trying to recover the handwriting samples for their father that were lost on board the ship, and also solve that particular mystery, which actually winds up being tied in to the family feud and the long history of this feud in this town. So it could be considered a little bit coincidental, but I think it's actually done quite well because it's not expected. And even the boys themselves are surprised to learn that there's an actual connection to the case that Fenton Hardy is working on with the case they're actually involved in. So it's a very, it's well constructed in terms of the story. It puts the boys themselves under the microscope. They're having to prove their innocence, so there's greater drama because if they fail, they'll be thrown in jail and their lives are pretty much over. So there's definitely the sense of a ticking clock. There's a sense of urgency. But it also takes quite a while to get to the main setting of the town, which is completely different in the revised text. So if you switch over to the revised text, we have the boys seeing their father off on a ship journey at the start, and that's where they're met by Bart Worth, who's a small-town southern newspaper editor who is trying to obtain the services of Fenton Hardy and essentially has to settle for the Hardy Boys themselves, which is a common sort of trope of the Hardy Boys stories. Somebody wants to hire Fenton Hardy and can't for whatever reason and goes, oh, well, I guess you boys will do. I know you've had some success. But essentially, he implores them to assist him because there is a long-standing family feud between the Blackstones and the Rands in this small southern town. And he was reporting on an aspect of it when he claims someone slipped in a potentially libelous note about the history of the Blackstones and their fortune going back to smugglers and pirates and obtaining their fortune through various illegal means. And so he has to now prove these claims because Blackstone has brought a libel suit against him. So the boys do decide to assist him in this, and they get to the small town relatively quickly, of course, with Chet Morton in tow. So we have the same setup of the feud between the Blackstones and the Rands. We have the same sort of setting. We have the same sort of Southern Gothic atmosphere of the two mansions on a big estate with the overgrown trees and all the wonderful atmosphere, particularly in the nighttime scenes. And the Hardy Boys, along with Chet Morton, are out camping in like the far corner away from the mansions where they're not going to be observed. But the difference is in focus because now the boys themselves are not under the threat of being thrown in jail for and falsely convicted of a crime they didn't commit. And it's now shifted to the Bart Worth character, which is something you see in the revised text. They try to keep the boys from getting into actual trouble and having to get themselves out of it. So that's part of what you'll find is seemingly like the revision playbook of making the Hardy Boys more clear-cut and, you know, with all the I's dotted and T's crossed, and they are essentially, they kind of act like deputized police agents, and they cooperate with the police everywhere, and it's a bit less textured and a bit less gritty in that way. So that's kind of something you start to expect when you do these comparisons the more you read. So once again, the blame is shifted away from the Hardys, and they're having to help someone get out of the situation they're in instead of getting themselves out of it. But we are getting to the main thrust of the plot more quickly. And because we do this, we actually get a lot more time for further details about the family feud, about the Blackstones and the Rands. We get much more detail about the estate and the sort of inherent Southern Gothic creepy atmosphere, especially at night. We also get more about the backstory of the feud itself, and this comes out that there also might be a lost treasure involved in and around the Hidden Harbor area, which is part of the sort of family legend. And no one exactly knows where this hidden harbor is because it doesn't seem to exist. So essentially, there's much more of a sense of there's skullduggery afoot, and the boys have increasingly more and more run-ins with danger, and the action really piles on because that's another thing that the revised text really tried to do. So the revised text gets us to the southern town much more quickly, gets us invested and right in the midst of this generational feud, and the boys are essentially camping out and seeing weirder and weirder things and having more and more near-death escapes. And this even starts before they get to the town. So this is a revised text example of where there's an action beat or cliffhanger over and just continually again and again and again and again. And it doesn't let up. So it is very much the cut to the chase approach that you find in the revised text. And you do lose some of the texture and the plotting, the more leisurely plotting that feels a bit more realistic in the original text that McFarlane wrote. So there is that trade-off, and the revised text does continually add action beat after action beat after action beat, and it basically gets to the point where you're just getting into this rhythm of there's going to be another action beat. There's even, because it's 1961 now in the revised text, there are attempts to try and include some more modern tech moments. The boys do a lot of secret scuba investigating in the sort of offshoots of the ocean, looking for Hidden Harbor, and they're doing this at night. And there's also, they're menaced by what seems to be a sea monster. So that's a unique element that was not in the original text. But the action really piles on. This is one of the most action-oriented of the revised text. And there is something to be said for that it does keep up the pace. And because we get to the sort of main setting of the book much more quickly. In fact, very quickly. We're able to get much more detail, and Buechler adds extra bits of business, extra beats, extra sequences, and the whole plot is radically different. But the core remains the same, because you essentially have the long-standing family feud, and there's this sort of third party that's obviously behind the scenes trying to orchestrate things and further the feud for their own nefarious ends. And it's up to the boys to figure out exactly who is responsible for what. Now, the biggest change, of course, is they basically eliminate the third party primary villain character of the original text, who is the black character with the very stereotyped dialogue. We do keep the idea that there's a third party who is essentially revealed to be the main villain, but we no longer have the racial stereotyping. So that is the most understandable and fitting change, and it's otherwise the same sort of core plot. It's just handled differently, and there's so many additional action beats that the boys don't quite know which of the three parties is exactly responsible for each of them until the very end. The pacing is, of course, increased dramatically, but there's a lot more focus on the atmosphere of the small town and trying to solve the mystery of Hidden Harbor itself and potentially the treasure. And if that weren't enough, there's also apparently a Native American burial ground or archaeological site that also might be on the grounds that people are interested in. So there's another MacGuffin as well that's added into the mix later on in the book. And the revised text also has a great example of how you handle one of those same characters from the original text and do it without the stereotyped dialogue, because it does retain the other black secondary character from the original text, who is essentially the longtime caretaker or main butler of the Blackstone estate. And he essentially has the same purpose in the book, in the revised text, but he speaks in normal dialogue and doesn't have any of the broken speech or affectations that are the racial stereotyping found in the original text. And it's quite refreshing, because you read the original text and you know that's coming, and you can tell the author was not intending to offend anyone, but it is, by the nature of the stereotyping, offensive in and of itself. But then in the revised text, you have that same character retained, essentially serving the same purpose and having scenes that mirror the original text, but without any of the stereotyping there, which is nice to see. So it is obviously possible to have even essentially the same character in a version of the same scene without the stereotyped dialogue. So we do actually get to see that in the revised text. If you pay close attention and you read these back to back, you'll notice that that same character is essentially retained, but all of the stereotyped dialogue is removed, and those scenes are modified just a tiny bit, but it's mainly the dialogue is now perfectly normal and without any of the racial stereotyping. So I think that's a really good example of what the stereotyped dialogue is in a negative way, because you have essentially a perfectly normal version of that same scene without the stereotyped dialogue in the revised text. All in all, this is an example of a text revision that is, I mean, it's basically a different book under the same title, but it still has the same core plot in terms of the family feud that's multi-generational between the Blackstones and the Rands in a small southern town, and the boys are camping out while mysterious skullduggery is going on, and they try to solve that mystery. But everything else outside of that is different in the two texts, and the tone and the approach is different because the revised text is much more about action, 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 and it's actually quite exhausting to read through because it's so many action beats that it's one of the more action-packed of even the revised text. And there is something to that approach, but also it doesn't hold up against McFarlane's more textured and nuanced and really lived in writing. So this is another example where you have a well-written original text with some very dated aspects, obviously, but with some issues of its own. And then a really great revised text with tons of action, tons of new plot material, a different approach to the actual plot structure, which makes it unique, but it also doesn't have the same texture in its writing as the original text does. So I think both are examples of what you can expect for the original and revised text, but it's hard to really say either one is better than the other. I do think the original text is better written, but it's not really a fair contest when you've got a Leslie McFarlane book, because he was essentially the creator of the series, wrote the vast majority of the first 26 original text books, and was a great writer in his own right. But there is something to be said about the revised text getting into the main plot and getting to the main location more quickly. I think there's enough new and unique material, and the subplots are new and different to really give it an edge. And the action beats are, filled with plenty of danger. There's an enormous amount of near-death escapes in this book, much more than what you usually get even in a revised text Hardy Boys book. So I think this is probably an example of where it's overall a draw. And you also have to look at the original text as being one of the most notable for having racial stereotypes in it. Although I don't think it's as bad or as terrible as what some people have made it out to be, it's definitely there. It definitely will make people sit up and take notice. It is a product of its time. But also, interestingly, there's not as much of it as what you got in, say, Footprints Under the Window, which also had a lot more Chinese characters in terms of that book's plot. So there were more characters that had racial stereotyping instead of just pretty much the two that we have in Hidden Harbor Mystery. It's just that, like Footprints Under the Window, the main villain essentially is a character with racial stereotyping. And I think also the fact that it has the setting of a small southern town, and some other elements do sort of heighten that factor. I think had it been, say, a Western setting like Hunting for Hidden Gold, I think it might not feel as bad in terms of that. I think the southern town setting does unfortunately sort of accentuate some of that racial stereotyping, which is understandable. I even myself kind of felt that reading it this time. I had read the original text before, so, and I knew this was obviously one of the ones that people pointed to the most as having the most obvious of the dated aspects that were removed for the revision process. So again, you do have to look at this as a product of its time, but because we don't get to the main location as quickly as we do in the revised text, it honestly kind of takes a back seat for quite a long time, and we don't even really get fully introduced to this particular character until actually quite late in the book. And again, his appearances aren't all that large either. So because he's a sort of third party in the overall mystery, I think that also thankfully downplays some of the inherent racial stereotyping, because we don't actually get as many appearances from him. So essentially what I'm saying is it could be a lot worse, So this is definitely one of the original texts. You do have to go in knowing that you are going to run into the racial stereotyping, and I think it's further magnified by the southern town setting. But also, it is a better written book. I don't think the plot is as tightly structured as the revised text. So I do think the revised text does have some improvements and enough unique elements to make it hold its own against the original text. But it also doesn't have as much of the flavor. It doesn't have as much of the nuance, because the pacing is much more increased and it's about action. And also it has a slimmer page count. So it's hard for the revised text to compete against the originals in that regard. And again, when you've got the series creator versus somebody decades later, it's it's not a fair contest to begin with. So you do have to always keep in mind the Stratemeyer Syndicate had certain edicts and rules for the revised text. So the author didn't always have carte blanche to just create freely. But that's not to say there's not excitement and a real extraordinarily dramatic climax in the original text. The revised text has endless near-death escapes and builds to looking for the treasure, of course, but the real big standout sequence towards the climax of the revised text is the boys not only being menaced by alligators, but also being outside on foot in the middle of a raging hurricane that's sending trees everywhere being ripped out of the ground, and there's mudslides and tidal waves and everything, as you sort of see depicted on the cover of the revised text. So that's a really intensive scene. But the original text is actually even more dramatic because not to spoil anything, but just to give the setup of the original text climax. The boys are searching everywhere, trying to find a member of one of the feuding families who is actually mentally unstable and is usually kept under home care and not in public, who has escaped and actually gotten firearms, and they're trying to find him and calm him down and talk him down before the sort of mob of the town that's gotten together find him, because they quickly turn into a lynch mob. So yeah. Remember the first time I read the original text, I did not expect that for the climax, and it's ridiculously dramatic, and it admittedly kind of comes out of left field a little bit because you don't expect it to go there, but it is very dramatic. So that's an example of the original text having real dramatic stakes, and again, the whole time the boys are having to try to prove their innocence, because if they don't, they're going to be convicted of a crime they didn't commit and thrown in jail. So, the stakes are actually a lot higher, but the plotting being a bit leisurely in getting to the main location and being structured differently, it kind of goes in fits and spurts a little bit, it seems. So I don't think it's the strongest of the original text, and you do have to deal with the unfortunate racial stereotyping that is present. So again, I can't say that either of the original text or the revised text is necessarily better than the other, because I think each has really unique elements that are really worthwhile and great positives, and signs of the original text strengths and the revised text strengths. And I think the revised text makes enough changes that it's basically a different book, but it's also got a different approach to the plot and enough subplot material that I think it stands on its own. I do think it's one of the best or better revised texts. But again, it's not as well written or as textured as the original text. So I think this is a great comparison to make. I think this is one of the comparisons that will most show the difference between the original text of the Hardy Boys and the revising process. But it also is the one that has some of, if not the most notable, extremely dated racial stereotyping, which was partly why the revisions were done in the first place, and this is why it was one of the first books to be revised. So that's very understandable. So do go into the original text knowing that it is usually the one fans are the most aware of or discuss the most as having the most notable dated aspects and racial stereotyping. Now to talk about the cover artworks for this particular book, as I like to do in these videos. Hidden Harbor Mystery only has 3, so to go over these, we have the original J. Clemens Greder cover from the original edition of 1935, which was what you found on all of the original and earlier editions. This, of course, is done in the style that he was doing for the books around this time period. So we have a very striking action scene with bold usage of attention-grabbing orange and yellows and reds and browns. This is very similar to what he did on the cover of Footprints Under the Window or While the Clock Ticked. You can very much get that this is a pulp cover. It's a pulp era cover. And this is depicting the scene of the shipwreck from the opening, and it's Frank Hardy having to essentially throw a life preserver on Mr. Blackstone, throw him off the side of the ship before he dives off himself, because the ship is not only sinking, but it's literally about to explode. So it's a nice dramatic scene. Again, the color usage is really fantastic, and that's what grabs your eye. But it's just it doesn't quite look right when you look at the actual figures and the faces. The staging is great, and the aspect and the sizing is great, but I think it's really more of the positioning and especially the faces, like, because this is supposed to be Frank Hardy, and it's always looked a little weird to me. And if you don't know the book, you don't quite know who the older gentleman is. And he doesn't quite exactly look like the way that old Mr. Blackstone is described in the text. But at least it's a good cover with great color. It really grabs your attention, and it's of the era. So I like it, but it's by no means my favorite cover. And the covers that replaced it are even more dramatic. So I still really like this for it being one of the Greta covers, and it having all the really nice color and being very 1930s pulp magazine in terms of its feeling, but it's definitely the weakest of the three covers. Then we come to the 1950 second cover by Bill Gillies, and this has a lot of the hallmarks of what you see in the Gillies covers of, you've got an action scene, you've got the boys usually in the foreground somewhere. There's a good usage of color, but then there's usually quite a lot of dead space. So if you see this, we've got a lot of the ocean, we've got a lot of the skyline, and the exploding ship is actually quite small in the background. But because this is the ship explosion from the opening and a really dramatic action beat, and the way that the boys are positioned, I think this image works really well. And I think this is probably the best cover that Bill Gillies did for the series. It's really dramatic. The sort of open space for once doesn't detract from the danger factor, because it's on the open sea, and the open sea itself can be threatening when you're just literally floating in the rough ocean and you don't even have a life jacket or anything. So, and plus the ship is literally exploding behind them, and you can tell the boys just got away. They don't even have seemingly any clothes on. Of course, this is a bit modified because the actual scene in the book, the boys get separated, and it's Joe and Chet Morton by themselves. So honestly, since that's how it could be, you could actually look at this as actually Joe Hardy and Chet Morton swimming around, because Frank and Mr. Blackstone got separated and are presumed dead at first in terms of the original text. But I that's just a guess. It could be supposed to be Joe Hardy and Chet Morton, but I don't know. It's just a guess, because one is darker haired and one is blonde. But we essentially have two boys swimming away in the ocean with no clothes on from a ship that's not only wrecked, but it's literally exploding on the cover. So this is a real attention grabber. My only, again, slight complaint is that because it's Bill Gillies, it does have that sense of some of there's some dead space going on. So I think it could be a little bit more dramatic if the staging was a little different, but because the boys are in the foreground and they're sort of on the edges of the actual image, and they're obviously swimming for their lives, there's a sense of tension and danger, and they're looking back towards the exploding ship. So there's a sense of immediacy there. So I think this is actually a really fantastic cover. I think it suits the original text perfectly. I do think it is better than the original Greta cover. And for all of the Bill Gillies covers for the Hardy Boys, I think this is probably his best, because I think it works on all accounts. But it cannot hold a candle to the Rudy Nappy cover from 1962, which was done for the revised text and has been on all editions since. This is a masterpiece. This is one of my favorite book covers of all time. I think it's arguably a top contender for best Hardy Boys cover painting. this has everything you want in a book, especially if you're a boy looking for an adventure story. We have Frank and Joe in beautiful detail, in absolute mortal peril. The composition is beyond striking. They're, of course, being menaced by an alligator that's about to devour Joe Hardy in the middle of a raging hurricane that is beyond perilous. We have the cypress trees being uprooted. We have the sense of wind. We have the pounding rain. We have the boys looking absolutely terrified. And if that wasn't enough, the alligator is literally snapping at Joe Hardy's heels as Frank is trying to literally just stretch his arm out longer than it will go to pull his brother out of the water he's fallen into. And we have the sense of the swamp in utter turmoil. Again, the composition with Frank's form coming out of the left side and his arm reaching across, and Joe and Bottom sort of dead center. The look of terror on their faces. And again, just the overall sense of drama, the way the trees are in the background and they're pushing over towards the left, so the way all of the position is done, we have a sense of a sort of circular pattern of Frank reaching for Joe, Joe being approached by the alligator, and the trees behind the alligator, and the trees bending back over to the left. So that sort of circular pattern of where your eyes go almost creates the sort of circular pattern of watching, a hurricane spiral. So I'm probably analyzing this too much, but I think this is one of the most dramatic covers. I think it's one of the best, if not arguably the best Hardy Boys cover. I would be hard pressed to name a better executed cover. The only downside, of course, is that this is mashing together two different events from the book, because they get attacked by an alligator just before the hurricane sequence. But I don't mind a bit of dramatic license when it's an image as incredible as this. I think this is one of Rudy Nappy's great paintings. I would love to be able to see this hanging in an art museum someday, in an exhibition of Nappy's artwork. But this is another level of cover. This is the definitive image. You could technically apply it to the original text if you wanted to, but it would be much more of a stretch because these events don't happen in the original text. And I think this is a good example of how the revised text is so much more action-oriented than the original text in terms of the intensity and amount of the action. When you've got a cover like this, you know it's going to be a book that's worth the money. This is such an attention-grabbing cover. It's so full of action and drama and intensity and peril that no kid could resist this. So I think this is easily one of the best covers in the entire Hardy Boys series. Not just the canon, but all of the books overall. And I would be hard-pressed to name a better Hardy Boys cover than Rudy Nappy's cover for the revised text of the Hidden Harbor Mystery. Now, to go over the additions in my collection, for the original text, I was finally able to get a good, solid, clean copy of the second cover art design, and this still has the cover nicely intact, which is hard to do because the dust jackets were the first things to go, and they're the most valuable part of any vintage Hardy Boy edition. But I really wanted to get this one in good shape with a complete cover because I think this is, again, the best of Bill Gillies' artwork for the series. And you have really nice color on here. So this is one of the ones you really want to try and get a complete, good condition dust jacket for. And we do have the wraparound artwork, so that nicely works with the skyline and the ocean as well. The rear advertises for the Zane Grey Adventure series, which was around this time period. We open to find the orange Greta end papers, which are what you're going to find in all vintage editions of this time period. And then looking at the book listing, which amusingly the original owner was using as a checklist, which I always find rather cute to see in editions that I pick up. But this lists to The Clue of the Embers, which is book 35, so that would date this to about 1955 in terms of the edition. Of course, we have the title page with the original font design, and this being a later edition from 1955, it does not have the original front piece artwork that would have been in earlier printings and the original. But the other way you can always tell this is original, we do have the original 1935 copyright date. It's got the different text style in terms of the font. And you can see, of course, it's significantly longer, as most original texts are over 200 pages, and most revised texts are between 160 to 175 or so. And of course, there is page 1, and you can always tell the original text did use a completely different text layout and font when compared to the revised text. And then here is the iconic brown tweed actual book itself with the dust jacket removed, and the iconic logo of the boys on all of these editions. Here's the spine. And you can tell this is a lighter brown and slightly thinner printing because this is from the mid-1950s. That's usually a good indicator in terms of if you don't have the dust jacket, because you don't have the book list then. But if you actually look at the brown tweed hardcover itself, there's different colors and binding types and thickness levels and even some variation in the actual font of the title. So if you don't have the dust jacket, you can sometimes get a decent idea of the sort of age range, and most mid-1950s copies will have this sort of appearance of being a little lighter in the brown tweed and also being a little thinner in terms of the binding being a bit more solid. Then for the revised text, I just have my flashlight edition from when I was a kid, so this was the version I grew up with. Of course, I would like to get a nice picture cover edition someday just to have the Rudy Nappy artwork looking even better, because when you have the flashlight editions, they did take the original artwork and crop it a little bit because you did have to work in the flashlight logo and spine. Also, as you can tell on this printing, this is a bit lighter and the contrast is a bit different. This did happen on some printings of the flashlights, so sometimes they represented the original artwork really well. Sometimes certain printings overcropped them, or the color wasn't quite right. So if you have a flashlight copy and an earlier picture cover edition from any time in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, you can usually tell the picture cover versions are usually a bit less cropped, the color's deeper, and this can all depend on when and where it was printed, because any of the picture covers or flashlight editions can vary in terms of the overall quality, but usually a minty picture cover version will have a better cover art representation than the flashlight edition. This one is done well. There's not really any major cropping, but I've always noticed on this copy that it's definitely a bit lighter. It's a bit contrastier. So obviously it's not going to be quite as bold as an original picture cover edition, but I've just not found a super minty one in terms of the cover to have on hand in my collection. But that's definitely one of the picture covers I'd love to find someday. And the picture covers did start in the early 60s, so some were original text for a while, but since the Hidden Harbor Mystery was revised in 61, it's not really known for the original text to actually exist in a picture cover edition. So if you're looking for an original text, it's going to have to be an earlier hardcover edition with dust jacket in terms of having the first artwork or the second artwork, because it's not really known to exist in the picture cover form with the Rudy Nappy artwork. Of course, we open to find the traditional flashlight edition complete list of the 58 revised canon books with the revised text title. Of course, we have the front piece artwork and title page. Copyright information, of course, this is a 2000 printing. This is a really well done and solid flashlight edition, and I know I always say, but if you've got one from before 2005, you're pretty much in good shape, because it seems the copies made around this time period were more solid and they were paying more attention, because when I see flashlight editions that have printing errors or sloppier covers or the binding's not as tight, they're almost always from after 2005, when I think people were just not paying as much attention. So that's why I always encourage people, if you're looking for flashlight editions and book condition kind of is something that you're more observant of, the earlier copies from the 90s and early 2000s are better printed and manufactured. The revised text table of contents, of course, indicates this is the revised text because the page count is significantly shorter. But you can also tell this has the same core plot because a lot of the chapter titles are very similar to the original text in ways. And of course, here's page 1 with the iconic revised text font style and chapter layout. And of course, we have to look at the iconic revised text illustrations contained throughout. So to briefly go over these, here is a really striking 2-page spread when the boys are essentially marooned on a deserted island with an old lighthouse for a substantial amount of time. Here's a really striking scene where they have an entire brawl inside of a quite elaborate fun house in the room with the tilted floor. So essentially they're having a Dutch angle fight, if you will. And it's actually quite a brawl because it's 3 boys versus a big strapping guy who even pulls a knife on them. So he does have murderous intent, but it's really the setting that makes it ultra striking. Here's a small illustration of the boys walking through the hurricane in the swamp that's being torn apart. And then here is the final illustration where the boys are left on a boat that's been made to sink. So I guess this is technically where Buechler worked in this boys escaping the sinking boat on the open sea. So it's essentially the same moment, but completely different in how it's handled and rendered, and it's actually put at the end of the book instead of the opening of the book. And of course, the classic 90s 2000s handy dandy order form where you can send your money order or credit card information if you could convince your parents to order you more books. So those are my thoughts overall on reading the original 1935 Leslie McFarlane The Hidden Harbor Mystery and the 1961 revised text James Buechler The Hidden Harbor Mystery. The core idea and core plot is the same, but the approaches are entirely different, and the handling of the plot is entirely representative of how the original texts were done and how the revised texts were a completely different approach with a certain sort of strict set of rules. I do think the removal of the racial stereotyping was obviously necessary and important, and this is definitely one of the most notable examples of that in the Hardy Boys canon. And really, I think it's Footprints on the Window and The Hidden Harbor Mystery that are the biggest offenders in that, because most of the other books only have very minor degrees of this. And honestly, I have to admit, for works and other books and stories of that time period of the 20s and 30s, while it's unfortunate we do have the racial stereotyping in some of these particular examples, it could be a lot worse, because I've read or encountered quite a bit of material from this time period where you do run into stereotyping that is even more offensive or even worse. So any degree is obviously not something that you would do today, and it does need to be looked at for the context of the time in which it was written and how popular fiction and media was handled in terms of writing characters of other ethnicities. But on one hand, it could be a lot worse, but it was understandable that this was one of the first books the Stratemeyer Syndicate actually did the revised text for, and it's understandable why they wanted to remove the dated racial stereotyping. But they didn't have to actually rewrite the book from scratch. They could have just addressed that as they did with the other character in the revised text, in terms of addressing that in the actual diction and the actual writing of the dialogue. So there's an argument to be made as well that the Stratemeyer Syndicate was also trying to completely restructure the books and make them shorter and make them more cost effective, as well as updating the certain elements that they wanted to highlight as being insensitive or very dated in 1959. So it's understandable why they did the revision process, but it really wasn't necessary to go in and just rewrite the books entirely. But if you were going to focus on particular books, Hidden Harbor Mystery would obviously be one of the ones to focus on, because it has some of the most and most notable examples of racial stereotyping, which is unfortunately very much of the time in which it was written in 1935. But again, I do think the original text is better written because you've got the series creator, and it's nice to have a greater dramatic focus on the boys because they narrowly escape death at the opening only to find themselves falsely accused of a crime that they then have to prove their innocence. So there's a greater sense of drama, there's a greater sense of a ticking clock in that sense, but there's also a leisurely pace to the writing that allows for a greater degree of realism and grit in areas, but you again do have to deal with the fact that you are going to run into the racial stereotyping and the dated aspects of the plot, but also it takes a while to even get to the main story location. So honestly, it feels in some ways like two different books in that sense, because the whole first opening act to almost essentially getting closer to halfway through the book, we're dealing with the opening shipwreck and then the boys getting falsely accused and having to get out on bail and start trying to piece together this puzzle. And the revised text avoids all of that by getting us into the action pretty much immediately and getting us to the family feud and the small southern town and things. But we do have the shifts in blame, and the boys are now merely investigating a case instead of having to prove their innocence. So there is a lessening of the dramatic stakes, but then that's made up for by the intensity of the action being almost constant and having a more developed subplot. So I think you gain so much in the atmosphere and the unique subplot and unique elements and action set pieces of the revised text that I think this is a case where it's really a draw. I think the original text is better written, but you've also got the dated aspects, and it takes so long to really get the main thrust of the mystery going that it almost feels like two separate books in ways, where the revised text doesn't have any of those problems, but you lose out on character and texture from the original text. So I think it's good to read these together, actually. I think they complement each other in that way, and it allows you to recognize and appreciate the great unique aspects of the original text and the great unique aspects of the revised text. And I do think this is one of the best revised texts. So I think this is a great comparison that every fan of the series should try doing at least at some point. And with the Hidden Harbor mystery having some of the most notable, very non-politically correct, objectionable materials in it, this is definitely one of the books you should look to do a comparison to see what the revisions actually did in addressing those extremely dated negative aspects, which particularly pop up here in this book, and again, Footprints Under the Window most of all. So these have just been my thoughts on the Hidden Harbor mystery, rereading the revised text I grew up with and rereading the original text, and finally reading them back to back as part of this comparison review series. So as always, I hope my babbles about the Hardy Boys, the wonderful experience of rereading them as an adult, and the fascinating aspect of reading and directly comparing the original text and the revised text and looking at the revision process has been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you've read or enjoyed either text growing up or done a comparison reread for yourself, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. This is one of the books that definitely generates the most discussion because it's one of, if not the most notable for the racial stereotyping in the original text. So it's definitely a discussion starter and is the book that all of us fans point to whenever somebody brings up the racial stereotyping that is usually blamed for being the cause of the entirety of the reasoning for the revision process, which is not the case. There were other concerns, and the syndicate was also trying to cut corners and save money by making shorter books. But it was, this was definitely part of the rationale, but not all of it. But whenever the racial stereotyping and non-politically correct elements get brought up when people want to discuss that, pretty much all of us, the first thing we think of is the racial stereotyping and the Hidden Harbor mystery. It's nowhere near as bad as it could be, but it's definitely there, and you will definitely cringe in those moments. But again, it's a book from 1935 with a central black character who is partly the villain of the story. So again, it's understandable why reading this today, it is going to have some of that cringeworthy aspect to it. But again, you do have to examine this in the context of when it was written in 1935, and unfortunately, that stereotyping was still very prevalent at that period. But it is still a well-written book and does have all the great positives of the original text. But this should be a book comparison that is used as a discussion starter and a means of studying the aspects of the revision process of the Stratemeyer Syndicate, and also comparing two books where the revised text is having to deal with much more of that inherent negative aspect of what you find in some of the original text. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some vintage Hardy Boys editions to help complete your collection, or look for original text. But the Hidden Harbor Mystery is one of the hardest to find because it was revised very quickly. You're probably going to have a time searching out a clean, good, solid copy, as I did. So just be forewarned, it's probably going to take you a while. This is one of the most elusive because it was revised so quickly. So to everyone, please keep enjoying the Classic Hardy Boys series. I encourage all fans to do a comparison read of all the books and compare the text for yourself if you've never done it before, because it's extraordinarily rewarding and will give you a new insight into the books and give you a fresh approach to rereading the classic canon again. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.